Let's talk about public opinion because it's one of those topics that political science covers, but quite often it kind of gets glossed over as kind of an expectation of people just kind of knowing common sense issues on certain things. But it's quite surprising how little of it's actually common sense. So, getting into public opinion, it's important to understand what public opinion actually is. I mean, public opinion does not indicate this is exactly what everyone thinks. What it demonstrates is the people that you're sampling, the number of people that you're actually getting the information from, this is what they think at this particular time on a specific issue. Now, all sorts of problems can kind of come up immediately if you start thinking about it. And historically, it has happened this way. One of the biggest problems is not getting enough people. You don't have enough people polled to figure out what they actually think about something, then you're not going to get a good idea of what the general consensus of everybody else thinks. The other thing is we tend to take like a straw poll or a poll of a certain amount of people and then start putting that into much higher numbers than it actually might represent. And so quite often a lot of polls that have been done over the years are indicating some particular person is going to win in a particular election and they lose. And then the question is, was there a problem with the actual poll? And again, there was no actual problem with the poll, as in the people who were asked the questions were, able to answer to their best ability. It's assuming the questions weren't skewed in some way. But as long as they answered their questions and gave you the answers that helped answer whatever the question is asking in the first place, then you ended up with decent results. The problem comes in when you take that number of people and then you apply it to the larger scale of people affected. So if I went into Wheatfield, Wyoming, and I asked everybody who happened to be at a Walmart on that particular date how they feel about one particular issue, I'm only going to get that small segment of people who showed up at Walmart in Wheatfield, Wyoming on that particular issue. Now, if I took that number of people, because say they all were for one particular politician rather than another, and indicated that nationally this is the way the results are going to be, that's a bad sample. And so, or actually the sample is fine, but it's a bad interpretation of the actual sample. And unfortunately, there are a lot of media sources out there that actually do this. And a lot of it has to do with all sorts of different reasons. Some it could be just on the resources of the people doing the surveys, the media organization that's actually reporting it, such as it doesn't have the money, the manpower, or even the willpower to go out and ask that many people. Like I said, the resources are generally one of the biggest problems. And then there's also, skewed bias based on wanting certain results to happen. So if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, and I'm going out and I'm polling people, and I want the results to be Democrat or Republican based on what party I'm representing, and I start looking at the material that comes through and all of the results, and then start looking for anything that's good for the party that I'm part of, well, you get skewed results. And when I report that as good information, that tends to be very problematic because then other people may get influenced by my bad information. And that has happened quite often. During the last couple of elections, we've actually had quite a few cases of that. And the attempt is to move away from that, but we don't always generally do a really good job of that. And so going back to what I was saying about public opinion polls, again, it's just basically it's a survey of the public's opinion on a particular topic at a particular moment in time. And so anything beyond that is an interpretation, and it could be based on all sorts of other things. And I did mention a little bit about skewing the actual topic. Whereas, like, if I'm saying, asking you, do you like this particular politician? But before I actually ask you that question, I, set up that, crime is out of control, and this particular party is really good at stopping crime, or not stopping it, but preventing it. And this is the person running for that office. What's your opinion of this person? So your opinion may not actually be on the person. It may actually be on the interpretation of what was basically coded beforehand you actually got into the question. So in the early days of when we did polls, one of the biggest problems we had, and we're trying to get better and better at it, we took what were called straw polls, which is basically ask a large number of people the same question. Unfortunately, it was usually a biased sample, and we're trying to get better and better as we do things. And so those types of events and situations, as our polling process gets better, hopefully things get better, and the information we get from it becomes a lot more useful to us. So today we tend to do a number of different kinds of polls. We do in-person surveys, so we're basically standing there and saying, asking a question of somebody. We do telephone polling, which is not as useful as it used to be. It used to be really useful because most households had a telephone, and whoever was the person in charge of the house was generally the person who ended up answering that phone. At least that's generally how it was. Well, traditions change, and everyone may have a cell phone, but sometimes it's really hard to get a hold of certain people. Some numbers are blocked. Some people don't pick up their phones. Some people don't like the idea of any, telemarketer or public opinion poll in the first place, and refuse to answer unless they know who's actually calling. So you end up with fewer and fewer people being represented in your surveys. Then we have now also another source, which is called internet surveys. And so these are surveys that are done on the internet. And part of the problem with that is, like when we first started doing those, people would vote, 100 times because they're trying to get whatever their result is to be the winning result, which doesn't tell you anything about how the people feel. It just tells you about, who's capable of skewing a poll to make it worse. And so that ends up being a problem. And that's also one of the kind of criticisms that keeps waging against, the idea of online voting, is the idea that people will cheat and, add votes to one side or the other. And so as we get better and better at the technology of making sure that doesn't actually happen, that, each vote counts for one person, and only that person, then our types of results get better. So as it gets better for, polling, it also gets better for actual voting. So going forward, that's kind of helping a lot. And also the idea of sampling. The more random your sample is, the better off you are in the long run. But part of the problem is, and this often doesn't get mentioned when they're talking about public opinion polls, is if you have a very random sample, you're going to get quite a few different kind of responses based on how things are. But if your sample size is not high enough, you may end up with some very bizarre responses based on the randomness of what you actually chose. So again, you have all sorts of problems that kind of come in and needing to compensate for those particular issues. Fortunately, political scientists have had a lot of history of dealing with this, and the better ones are actually trying to accomplish these types of results without actually those sorts of problems actually skewing samples. So what do polls tell us? A true result of a poll is a range of possible probabilities, which means all sorts of different things can actually happen. And so anytime you hear a poll that tells you, this poll tells us exactly this, be kind of suspicious, because it may be somebody wants you to think it tells you that and then hopes to change literally your vote or whatever your perspective is based on whatever they actually have skewed their chance. You get the idea of that. And then sampling error and percent confidence. these sorts of things kind of come about, which have more to do with the statistical nature of how we actually do these polls. But these sampling errors are really important, and sometimes they get glossed over. Whereas a sampling error, so if it's like your vote has a 10% margin of error, that's pretty big, which means there may be 10% of those votes that may not actually be correct based on those numbers. And sometimes even the sampling error may be somewhat incorrect, although those are based on mathematical constructs to actually build those. So let's talk about, so I mentioned the bias in framing questions. So one of the problems we have is there's, like I said, if there's an attempt to change or to influence the way people actually think about something, is they'll create a poll that does just that. And so, and one of the other problems, and we've ran into this during a couple of elections, and the idea is not only just to frame the poll, frame the questions in the poll itself, but they'll do it in the poll in the hopes of actually influence your vote. So say they don't like, candidate A. What they'll do is they'll talk about all the evil things that candidate A has actually done, and then would you vote for him or her? And obviously you're kind of biased going forward, but when the actual election comes around, the hope is when they do that, is that you're going to think back and go, wait, that was the guy they were telling me was evil. And then hopefully you don't vote for them and you vote for the other person. So a lot of times negative polls are done this way, or negative approaches to polls where it's, throwing out all sorts of disinformation in order to try to get you to vote a different way. So you have to be really careful of that and kind of cognizant of the knowledge of what's actually really going on in the world. And sometimes they take advantage of the fact that not everyone does. Also, the timing of polls. Opinion polls must be taken often to be accurate, because if events happen that cause all sorts of things to change and minds to change on different issues, it may cause the people to think a completely different way. One of the other types of polls we'll talk about in a second here is called exit polls. And these are often done when people are leaving a polling place. So they'll go and vote, they'll come out, and then they'll get asked questions like, how did you vote? Because you can't ask them questions in the actual polling place, and you can't actually do the same thing while they're, well, at least you're not supposed to be able to do it while they're standing in line, but it also depends on a certain amount of distance from the actual location of the election actually taking place. But anyway, what they'll do is they'll stand outside and they'll ask you who'd you vote for, and then they take those numbers and they tell you, we think this side is going to win based off of the exit polls that we took. And some of them are getting really, really accurate in the information they give us. Rarely do they end up being wrong unless they're so close that, again, nobody's really paying attention to the margin of error again. There's a lot of misuse of polls. Sometimes the polls themselves, like I said, can be used to create public opinion. And so when that happens, that basically kind of creates a bandwagon effect and almost like a slippery slope, all sorts of fallacies if you think about it. And so we try to avoid that as much as possible. But again, if there are entities out there that have a specific agenda in mind, they may take these efforts to do it. And there are some really, really interesting people out there that will do all sorts of things in order to get their candidate to win. And also the media can, just by the sake of being people or by being biased themselves, they can misuse polls to say something other than what they actually meant. We do that with interpreting scientific data all the time, where they'll talk about something like global warming, and one group of people will look at the same information that somebody else did and come up with completely different data or different results based off the data. And so you have to be very suspicious of that, because quite often what happens, and this is where you really pay close attention to what's going on, is what they'll do is they'll report the information, but they won't actually inform you anything further about where to get that information from, so you can double check what they actually did. And so they throw out all this information at you, and then just kind of hope it just kind of slips by and it goes back into the back of your mind that, oh, something evil happened. This guy was associated with evil, and therefore he must be evil. And so they make these sorts of connections as they go through. And so I mentioned a little bit before about what's called push polls. And a push poll is when they take basically fake polling questions. So basically the question is not really, it's like the old kind of insult joke of, are you still beating your mother or beating your wife or whatever the line was, which is something you should never do. But I mean, what I mean is the way they ask the question is it's misleading to where people go, wait a minute, they don't take enough time to pay attention and go, that's just a bad question. You shouldn't be asking that, And so what ends up happening is I get asked a question as a question, and so it causes people to answer and skew their answers without even realizing they're actually doing it. So if you're a poll taker, you should never do that. And if you're somebody taking a poll, you should be very suspicious of any time you ever see somebody doing something like that. Okay, let's talk about how people actually form their public opinions, or political opinions, sorry. Their political opinions are generally formed, and for quite a few people, based on their family. And so people have a really bad habit of thinking this isn't the case, because people are really, really good at looking at specific situations that have happened in their lives and then taking this information and applying it to so many other things. So like, I'll give you an example. So if somebody had a problem in his or her family and so didn't get along with his or her parents, that person will then attribute that information and cross-apply that to everybody else out there and say, well, everybody has that problem, and so people don't think the same way as their parents. But actually, in reality, done over time, statistically, and by statistically I mean over large numbers of people tend to vote the same way that their parents did. So somebody who was historically a Republican or Republican-leaning, or the ideas of what were Republican at that time, at this time, were generally the same sorts of thinking kind of going back in time. And it has a lot to do with not just the person who brings them up, but also has to do with their environment that they're living in. And so there was a reason some of those people were actually of a particular political partisan basis, and it has a lot to do with where they were from, their socioeconomic background, all of this other information. And so because of that, that kind of made them what they were. So a person in another generation coming in later may fall into those same sorts of things, and the same type of environment to have a lot of those same kinds of beliefs. It's why a place like, Michigan can have quite a few liberals in certain areas and Republicans in certain others, because in those little pockets of areas, they grew up a different way. Whereas in Texas, quite a few people were conservatives, stayed conservatives, and then passed that on to other people to be conservative. California, you have kind of the opposite, which is a lot more liberal in most of the areas, but then very small segments of population happen to be Republican. And so you'll have a lot of conservative thinking people in some areas and liberals thinking in others. And the way government tends to change over time is those numbers spread out and become more powerful. And during elections, what's really important is to find those kind of similar thinking people and then get them to actually show up and vote. So there's other influential, aspects as well, such as churches and schools. Schools are really important. They teach young people all sorts of values in different ways, and a lot of socialization comes from them. Whereas religion also has its similar kind of control mechanisms and influence mechanisms. I don't mean control mechanisms, but I mean influence mechanisms that cause people to think certain ways, which again, all these little social elements that we have built into your day to day are what affect your overall kind of experience. And so, like I was saying before, family tends to kind of stay the same. Whereas what you'll have every now and then is like, they have the black sheep in the family kind of one, where the person breaks off from what the parent thinks, starts, growing up and doing their own little thing. And you think they're going to change and be like, go from conservative to liberal or from liberal to conservative. And what ends up happening is over time, because the area that they're in influence them just as much as family would have before. And while they may have like thrown away family ties, slowly the community brought them up. So you'll see, again, somebody who started off in a conservative background eventually becomes conservative, whereas somebody who started off in a liberal background will become liberal, just because their community and place where they're in kind of changes and influences the way that they actually think. So also one of the other kinds of things that help people get their political opinions is media. And so what you're watching can have a lot to do with how your political opinions kind of develop over time. And the more type of influence you get from particular different pieces of media can cause you to start thinking different ways. So there are people who have, started off, very liberal, then over time became more conservative, whereas the same thing, started off very conservative, and maybe an event or maybe a number of stories or certain things that happen in their communities cause them to change and go the other direction. So, I mean, these things do happen, and so these influences happen, but quite often people tend to stay pretty uniform throughout their lives, and then again pass it on to their family, to their their children, and basically those lines just kind of keep going on. And that's historically how things have generally been. Also, one of the other influences, and it's not as strong as some of the others I mentioned, that's opinion leaders themselves. So quite often you'll have a very, very gregarious type of a person that really gets people to really pay attention or want to be more like them. And so that person can influence and get a whole bunch of people to kind of do all sorts of things that they probably never would have intended to do before, but it's their persuasive nature kind of makes that actually happen. And one of the other things, and this happens to a number of people over their lifetimes, is something happens that's major. And it can be to an individual and it can be to a society. Like the Great Depression changed a whole lot of different perspectives on how all sorts of things should be dealt with in life. And all the things that happened at that time caused people to literally think, okay, I've been thinking wrong all along. The only way to solve this is to do this. World War II caused a lot of that to happen. Practically every war we've ever had has caused people to think differently. Or think more in the same way they were. The terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001, that definitely caused a whole bunch of people to think differently than they did before. The Obama administration, all sorts of things, like Obamacare caused all sorts of people to think different ways. The Trump administration and many things they did, immigration, all of these issues that kind of came up can be things that cause people to change the way they think. The end of the rotary dial phone changed people's public opinions. I mean, because people even, just the difference in how you use your phone can cause people to think in different things. So it can be all sorts of different influences that are available that make people think differently than they thought before. And one of the other influences is on public opinion is peer groups. So your friends may help you actually think a different way, or just people you respect, and like what they're actually doing or want to be like. Basically, if a Cardassian is telling you that this is the way you should be voting, people may actually do it. Recently, or during the 2020 era, Taylor Swift started actually becoming political. People who were never political before, but were big Swifties or whatever you want to call them, suddenly became politically active just based off of that. So, I mean, it can be any sorts of influence that causes people to become more politically active or just politically knowledgeable in ways they had not thought of being before. Back during the 1970s and the 1980s, Madonna caused a whole bunch of people to think differently just politically because of social things that she was doing at that particular time. She still tries to influence people today, but people don't follow her as much as they did. So, I mean, these things all have their ebbs and flows as we kind of go along. Other things that kind of affect is like your occupation. Sometimes your coworkers can influence each other. Even how much you make can make a big difference on how you think politically. So if I'm making a lot of money and I'm an economist, my economic values, a cost benefit analysis may make more difference to me than whether or not helping my fellow citizen may make a difference. I'm not saying economists are all against helping people, but what I mean is it it can favor one thing over another based on the simple idea that you're exposed to all sorts of different ideas. Anything can cause you to think one way or another because everyone's different. People are coded to be whatever they're going to end up being. And so they may do all sorts of things based off of situations that people can't even imagine for a million years. All right, so why do people vote as they actually vote? Well, again, party identification. It's like if you identify with the Republicans or the Democrats, chances are pretty good you're going to vote for that particular party, unless you really, really don't like a specific candidate. In the old days, by old days, I mean way back in the early days, 1960s and earlier, the idea of party identification was the most important thing. So if you were a Democrat, you voted for Democrats. It was simple as that. They had literally just party voting. So you literally got a ticket and turned in your Democrat ticket. And the Republicans did the same thing. And so the difference is we got away from that. We got to a more, it's more candidate based. It's you don't vote for a particular party anymore, but you vote more for a candidate. And sometimes there's an ebb and flow on that. So you'll find some certain elections where party becomes more important than it's ever become before because you realize you need the entire party in order to change the mindset of certain issues that are kind of taking place. And we kind of run into that from time to time, and we're in the 2000 era, we ran quite a bit into the political flow again. Then it went back to a candidate-centered flow back in 2010 or so. 2020 is turning back into a party identification era again, to where people are really paying closer attention to parties, because sometimes what ends up happening is it takes an entire party to change things happening because you can't seem to get individuals to make a difference. So, like I said, ebb and flow, and it just over time that tends to change. So, depending on kind of the needs and the way things are actually going, and so let's talk about candidates themselves, because we have hit a point in our time where we really do pay attention to the candidates. So, candidates have a tendency of being really important in their qualifications for voters. So like if a particular candidate running doesn't have the necessary requirements to run for office, then or to hold that office, then quite often they're not put into power. And then other times they literally have no connection to having to fulfill the needs of that office, to where people want something new, and then they'll vote somebody like that in. Like an example is during the Trump-Clinton election, whereas Clinton came in as someone who represented a lot of the ideas of, previous government, someone with a lot of government experience against somebody who was literally completely from the outside. And we were in a time where we had gone from kind of a mindset of, you need government in order to take care of things, and got to a point where government might be part of the problem. And so basically you had kind of a backlash going against that. And so that's kind of why you have a Trump administration came along. And so these sorts of things happen, and they do affect the way that decisions are actually made. So another reason people tend to vote the way they do, socioeconomic factors, like I mentioned, could be your education. And I don't mean one party smarter than another, but I mean one party may actually think a specific way based off of, different types of educational values. Also occupation. It's no secret the Republicans tend to gear towards a more higher socioeconomic status, whereas Democrats tend to be more reflective of, the common people. But then if you really take those numbers out there, the majority of the representation of the Republican Party is pretty much all across America with pretty much everybody, and not always do those socioeconomic factors stick. So that's important to kind of understand when you're studying all sorts of things, because remember I mentioned area may have a lot to do with it, and so a rich person in Texas may not think the same way as a rich person in, say, California. Also, age is really important. Over time, age has a real big effect on how people think on certain things. And it also has a huge effect by the fact that older people tend to vote more. And it's just because they've been around a lot longer. That doesn't mean they're smarter. It just means they've been part of the system a lot longer. And sometimes younger people don't participate because it could be either apathy, or it could be things are happy the way they are, or basically don't like the system as it is, because, the rebellious against the way the system actually works. And so that ends up causing a bit of a problem, but that changes over time. And so different age brackets will think all sorts of things, to where some of the young today are actually participating more in government elections than they ever have before, which means that young generation will grow up having voted a lot more than, say, the middle generation that starts retiring. And so that middle generation that starts retiring, then is no longer the representative population of the people who actually vote. It's the younger people that'll become the people who voted. But by that time, there'll be a brand new generation down at the bottom, younger, not bottom as in lowest, but who may or may not be a voting population based off the circumstances that they're growing up in at their particular time. And it's hard to say where they are because some of them haven't even been born yet. So that's just kind of how it works. One of the other ways that people tend to vote is gender. Gender has a huge difference back and forth, and that has changed over time. Women got the right to vote in 1920, so that all sorts of people who have been voting haven't been voting for more than 100 years. And I don't mean the same people, but I mean as a demographic, gender, this is a group of people who did not have the right to vote and are getting more and more prestige and power as we go along. We have more people, more women serving in government than we ever had before. It just means more and more women are being voted in. And so I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing or anything to that effect, but it is an economic factor, socioeconomic factor to kind of focus on as we're going through. Also, religion and ethnic background has a huge socioeconomic factor. And quite often it gets glossed over, but it is really important. And as I mentioned before, geographic regions. The South, Great Plains, and parts of the Rocky Mountains are basically Republican, whereas the Northeast, West Coast, and Illinois generally are Democrats. Then there's the Solid South, which kind of hails all the way back to the war between the states. But the Solid South has generally stayed one way. But by that, I mean they've either been conservative or liberal. And the people who live in those areas have generally stayed the same way. Now, over time, the parties may have changed their names, but that doesn't necessarily mean the people changed the way that they actually think. And so that's understandable on all sorts of other subjects. Ideology, people vote based off of ideology. Political spectrum is pretty much is an indicator of how people are going to vote. Liberals tend to vote for Democrats. Conservatives vote for Republicans. There's a little bit in between, but we're basically a two-party system. That's kind of how it actually works. And so it's mainly the main thing on that. And so let's talk about voter turnout. Voter turnout over the years has been worse and worse as we go through. Non-voters just don't feel a duty to vote. Quite often, they're either happy with the way things are, or they're not happy with the way things are and just don't feel like they have a voice and ever will. And so a lot of times people are trying to influence people who aren't voting. They'll tell them, if you don't vote, you can't make a difference. Or one of my favorite arguments, which is not really one of my favorite, is, well, if you don't vote, then you don't have a right to say anything. Just completely wrong. The fact is, you are a citizen. You can say anything you want to say. People don't have a right to tell you can't say what you want to say. Although they do have a right to tell you can't say that. It's just it doesn't hold any water. And so when there's this belief that your vote's not going to make a difference, people tend to just kind of bow out of the whole situation. Now, during the 2016 election, a lot of Democrats sat out the election because they didn't like the Democratic candidate. And so Hillary Clinton was the candidate, and a lot of Democrats just didn't like Hillary. And so because of that, they did not vote. And so there's this weird interpretation that, that means they supported, Donald Trump, which they didn't. They just didn't like Hillary Clinton, but didn't like her and didn't dislike her enough to vote for Trump, but at the same time, not enough to cause the Democrats to beat Trump, if that makes any sense. So it's one of those little factors that kind of keeps in there. So over time, since about 1968, voting has gone down, and it's historically just keeps getting worse and worse as we go through it. And part of it has to do with our electoral system itself. We have the Electoral College, and as pretty much the only country around that actually uses it, it's not very representative to a lot of people, and therefore they don't think they have a say-so in it. And some people don't even understand it and think they're not even actually getting to vote for president. They are, but they sometimes don't understand. And so let's go back to like the legal right to vote. That's been a problem as well, because historically we didn't let everybody vote in this country. And so in the beginning, we didn't even treat most people as citizens. And so a lot of it had to do with you had to be a landowner and you had to be white. And that's changed over time as we've interpreted the Constitution to stand for a lot more people than just that. But that takes time, and because it took time, a lot of the people who got to start voting still haven't become a strong component of the electoral system. Now, the 15th Amendment authorized all African Americans to be able to vote, but again, we're talking, after 100 years of this country being around, and we've literally only been around another 100 years since then. And again, women just started getting the right to vote just 100 years ago. So, we haven't been doing this for a whole lot of time, even though the country has been around for a lot longer. And so the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, which is really important. And basically the 26th Amendment reduced the minimum voting age to 18, because before then, you literally had to be older just to vote. And so we keep adding more stipulations to that, but it usually takes an amendment to make that sort of thing happen. Um, so there are still some restrictions that do exist today, like you have to register to vote. A lot of countries don't make you do that. A lot of countries will actually just basically, you're born in the country you registered, and you don't have to vote. You don't have to do anything, and you vote. We make it a lot harder. If you want to actually vote, you have to indicate that you want to vote. You also have to have residency requirements. So if I want to vote in the state of, you know, Utah, I must live in the state of Utah and for a certain amount of time before the actual election. So all sorts of little stipulations like that in order to make it so you can actually even participate in the system that exists around you. So there are attempts to improve voter turnout to get more people to vote, but then again, it's party based sometimes because some parties don't want certain locations in the country to vote. And so if your goal is to win a particular election, and you realize that getting more and more people to vote, it could cause all sorts of problems, because the people who then come to vote may be the people who would not vote for you or your party going forward. And so all these restrictions keep getting put into it, and we'll talk much more about that probably at another time. Um, and so a couple of states, well, like Oregon, for example, all elections in the state can actually be conducted by mail, which is an interesting thing, whereas other states have all sorts of restrictions put on it. And in order to vote by mail, you literally have to, be a veteran overseas, or handicapped in some way, or challenged in others. I mean, there's all sorts of stipulations that they put in there to make that actually happen. And whereas with the virus, the 2020 virus, all sorts of attempts were made to actually make, state voting actually a lot more easier conducted by mail, but there's a lot of struggle to make that happen because, again, like I said, there are certain segments of the population that don't want other segments of the population to vote and will do anything to curtail that from happening. And so, and they use all sorts of different excuses for it, protecting the vote, illegal activity and all this, which quite often generally doesn't happen. Historically, there are no situations that happen in that other than select few cases, but you get that in actual regular voting as well. And people kind of gloss over that fact as well. So there's a couple of attempts we've made in order to improve voting procedures, which is like the Help America Vote Act, which was to help states, purchase new electronic voting equipment. There are some questions as to whether or not some of it was on the up and up, but that's totally a different issue. In 2006, half the states using electronic voting had problems. So, I mean, there's sometimes attempts to move back to paper ballots. Like I said, there's been an approach to make things more online for, just safety of viruses and diseases and stuff like that. There was a really interesting attempt in New Guinea, the country, where one of the problems they realized is they had more of like our winner-take-all system, which is our electoral college system. And so they tried to move away from it and make it a proportional representation system. And they instilled that and did a whole bunch of education behind it and tried to get everyone really involved in that. And their numbers of voting went from, kind of what we are, 40%, to about 90-something%. And it was like considered a huge, great success. And then about a decade or so later, those numbers started falling back again. So you ended up with, 70, 60%, and then back down to 50, 40%. And so what they realized is people just didn't want to vote. They didn't want to take the work to actually do it. And so the New Guinea experiment was actually considered more of a failure than anything else. When I was first teaching this class, I used to talk about it as the success it was, but then, like I said, over the years, time proved that it wasn't as successful as they kind of hoped it would actually be. So let's talk about a couple of, hold on one second. So a couple of different things on who actually votes. I mentioned before the majority of people who tend to vote tend to be older people. There is an approach to get a lot of people who generally didn't vote in the past to start participating in voting. And it has a couple of interesting positives to it, such as one, as people vote, they become a lot more interested in their government and become a lot more interested in, you know, helping government and helping their fellow citizens, which is a really, really positive thing. The other thing is it sometimes makes it very difficult for things to get done because whereas before when fewer people were participating, the politicians didn't have a whole lot of, need to support specific agendas, but as more and more agendas get put into the system, as necessities, more and more things have to be addressed, and suddenly a politician's time or a leader's time can get overwhelmed by just the sheer magnitude of the amount of people that are actually trying to gain some type of assistance or just approaching government in general. So that's the idea of voter turnout. It's voter turnout has not been getting better. There are all sorts of things that could make it better, such as changing the dates that we actually vote, such as make it over more days, to even to points of where if we just you know registered everyone and sent them a ballot and told them to vote, maybe that might influence a lot more people. But then you have a bunch of different kind of difficulties with that as well, such as if you sent everyone a ballot and they did participate and there was no cheating actually involved, there's no telling that you're going to actually get good responses in the voting, because you may have some really bad ideas from people on what they think is the right person to rule to run the government at that particular time. And so again, there's all sorts of give and takes with the whole thing, but what generally needs to happen is a conversation to figure out how to move things forward. And usually that doesn't happen because people are generally happy with the way things are, especially if they're the ones in government, because they're in government and anything that changes the status quo makes them very susceptible to not having the job that they had yesterday.